Imagine lying in bed late at night finishing homework when you suddenly hear scratching coming from beneath the floor of your room. At first you assume it's just a small animal hiding under the house. But when you knock on the floor to scare it away, something beneath the house knocks back, copying the exact rhythm of what you just did. Then a few minutes later, you look out your window and see a man crawling out from under your house and running toward the trees. Tonight's story comes from someone who grew up on the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, where the land itself carries stories about creatures that walk like animals and people. Welcome back to True Haunting Log, the place where real people share their most terrifying encounters with the unexplained. If you have experienced something paranormal, something that still keeps you awake at night, you can send your true horror story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com for a chance to have it featured here on the channel. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into tonight's story. Story 1. Skinwalker stalks me at night. I grew up in New Mexico on the Navajo reservation, and I've lived there my entire life. I'm 17 now, but the story I'm about to tell started when I was much younger. My grandmother owned a small shop that sold old Navajo relics and traditional items. The shop sat near a dusty road that ran through our small community, and people from nearby towns often stopped there to look at the items she had collected over the years. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of afternoons sitting quietly in the corner of that shop while my grandmother talked with customers. Sometimes they spoke about ordinary things like family, work, or the weather, but every now and then the conversations drifted toward the strange stories people tell about the land around us. My grandmother never told those stories the way people do when they're trying to scare someone. She spoke calmly, like the things she was describing were simply part of the world we lived in. One of the things she mentioned many times was something people called skinwalkers. She never said anything cruel about them or described them like monsters from movies. Instead, she explained that some people believe certain individuals could take the form of animals and move through the night unnoticed. When I was younger, I didn't think much about those stories. To me, they sounded like old legends that had been passed down for generations. But there was one story she told that always stayed in my mind. She said that when her aunt was a young girl, she used to see a deer standing outside her bedroom window every night at midnight. The animal would appear almost like clockwork and simply stand there staring into the house. According to my grandmother, the deer never moved or made a sound. It just stood there watching. What made the story strange was the way she described its eyes. My grandmother said they were completely black, darker than anything she had ever seen on a normal animal. One night, her aunt decided to wave at the deer through the window just to see what it would do. The moment she lifted her hand, the deer slowly stood up on its hind legs and began walking toward the window like a person. After that, her aunt never looked out the window at night again. When I heard that story as a kid, I thought it was just another strange legend. But a few years later, something happened in my own house that made those stories feel very real. Our house was built slightly raised above the ground, which meant there was a crawl space underneath it. Small animals sometimes hid down there, so hearing noises beneath the floor wasn't unusual. One night I was lying on my bed doing homework when I heard a scratching sound coming from directly below my room. At first it sounded like an animal moving through the dirt under the house. The noise was faint but steady, like claws slowly dragging across wood and soil. I tried to ignore it and continued working, but the scratching kept going for several minutes without stopping. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a broom that was leaning against the wall and struck the wooden floor 3 times as hard as I could, hoping whatever was down there would run away. The scratching stopped immediately, and the room fell silent. For a moment, I felt relieved because I thought the animal had finally left, but then something beneath the floor answered back. 3 slow impacts came from directly under my bed, each one spaced out carefully like it was copying exactly what I had just done. The moment I realized the pattern matched perfectly, the fear hit me all at once. For a few seconds I couldn't move. I just sat there on the bed staring down at the floorboards, trying to convince myself that there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe something had fallen in the crawl space. Maybe an animal had knocked into the support beams. Maybe the sound only seemed like it copied me because my brain wanted to find a pattern. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't true. The rhythm had been too perfect. I slowly lowered the broomstick and rested it against the wall beside my bed. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it shaking in my chest. The room was completely silent again, and the quiet somehow felt worse than the noise that had come before it. When a strange sound stops suddenly, your mind fills the silence with possibilities you don't want to think about. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the scratching returned. This time, it wasn't faint like before. The sound dragged slowly across the underside of the floorboards, moving from one side of the room to the other. It felt like something large was crawling directly beneath me. I could hear dirt shifting and wood creaking softly as the thing moved under the house. The sound stopped again. A moment later, something struck the underside of the floor. The wooden boards beneath my mattress vibrated slightly as the impact traveled through the frame of my bed. A second impact followed, heavier this time, and I felt the bed legs scrape faintly against the floor as the structure shifted. Whatever was beneath the house was strong enough to shake the room. I froze. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make a sound, not to give whatever was down there any reason to keep trying to get my attention. I stared at the ceiling and tried to breathe quietly through my nose. Another strike came from beneath the floor. The vibration rolled through the boards like something heavy had slammed into the support beams under my bed. The pounding continued for several seconds before suddenly stopping again. And just like before, the silence that followed felt unbearable. My room felt colder than it had a few minutes earlier. The small desk lamp on the other side of the room barely lit the corner where my bed sat. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the faint light made the wooden floor look darker than usual. I slowly turned my head toward the window beside my bed. The shutters were slightly open, leaving a narrow crack where I could see outside into the yard. At first, I saw nothing but the dark tree line behind our house. The trees on the reservation grow thick and uneven, their branches twisting together in strange shapes against the night sky. There wasn't much moonlight that night, so the forest looked like a solid wall of black stretching across the horizon. Then, something moved near the ground beside the house. At first, I thought it was just a shadow shifting across the dirt, but there wasn't any wind. The shape moved slowly forward from the crawl space opening beneath the house. I leaned closer to the window, trying to see clearly through the thin crack in the shutters. The shape dragged itself out from under the house and crawled across the dirt. For a moment, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then it stood up. It was a man. At least it looked like one. His hair hung down around his face in long, tangled strands, and his clothes looked filthy, like he had been crawling through mud or dirt for hours. Even from the distance, I could tell something about the way he moved wasn't normal. His back was slightly hunched. His arms hung too low at his sides, and when he straightened up, his posture looked stiff, almost unnatural. The man stood beside the house for several seconds without moving. Then his head turned slowly toward my window. The movement was so slow and deliberate that it made my chest tighten instantly. I dropped flat against my bed and pulled away from the shutters, terrified that he might see me watching him. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought he might hear it through the walls. For several seconds I stayed completely still, staring at the ceiling and trying to listen for any sound outside. Nothing. Eventually, curiosity forced me to look again. I slowly lifted my head and glanced toward the window. The yard was empty. The man was gone. I scanned the tree line carefully, expecting to see movement among the branches, but the forest looked completely still. Then, I noticed something standing near the edge of the woods. At first, it looked like a coyote. Coyotes are common where I live, so seeing one near the property at night isn't unusual. But something about this one immediately felt wrong. The animal wasn't moving. It just stood there perfectly still, staring toward the house. The faint light from the sky reflected in its eyes, giving them a strange orange glow. Most coyotes wander around constantly, sniffing the ground or pacing cautiously along the edge of the forest. This one didn't do any of that. It simply watched. After a few seconds, the animal stepped forward slightly, emerging from the deeper shadows beneath the trees. Its body looked thin and uneven, like its ribs were pressing against the skin beneath its fur. The fur itself looked rough and patchy, with darker streaks running along its back. And then I smelled something, even through the window. A faint, rotten scent drifted into the room. It was the same smell I had noticed earlier when the scratching had been happening beneath my bed. The coyote slowly lowered its head, its glowing eyes still fixed on the house. Then it began walking across the yard. Step by step, it approached the crawl space, opening beneath the floor. My stomach twisted as the animal reached the edge of the house. Without hesitation, it slipped beneath the crawl space. And a few seconds later, the scratching returned beneath my bed. The moment the scratching started again beneath my bed, every bit of fear that had settled in my chest returned twice as strong. The sound was louder this time, not the faint scraping I had heard earlier, but a heavy dragging noise, moving slowly across the underside of the floorboards. It sounded like something large was crawling beneath the house, pressing its body against the beams as it moved. I sat frozen on my bed, staring down at the floor like I could somehow see through the wood. My room felt strangely quiet, except for that sound. Even the air in the house seemed still, like everything was waiting for whatever was beneath the floor to finish whatever it was doing. The scratching moved slowly across the room. First, it was near the window. Then it slid beneath the center of the floor. Then it came back again. It felt like the thing below was circling the area beneath my bed. I remember thinking that maybe it was the same coyote I had just seen outside. Maybe it had crawled into the space beneath the house looking for shelter. That explanation made sense in my head for a moment. But then the sound changed. The scratching stopped, and something heavy shifted beneath the floor. The boards beneath my bed trembled slightly, like something had leaned its weight against the underside of the house. The vibration traveled through the wooden frame and into the mattress. I slowly pulled my legs up onto the bed. My breathing became shallow as I listened for the next sound. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then something brushed against the underside of the floor directly beneath me. The movement was slow and deliberate, like a hand sliding across the wood. I felt my stomach tighten instantly. Animals don't move like that. Animals scratch, they dig, they shuffle around. But this movement felt controlled, almost careful, like whatever was beneath the house knew exactly where I was. The boards creaked again. Then, something pressed upward against the underside of the floor hard enough that I could feel the pressure through the mattress. The bed shifted slightly. I grabbed the edge of the blanket and held my breath. For a moment, I imagined the board splitting open and something forcing its way through into the room, but the pressure disappeared. The weight beneath the floor moved away slowly, and then the scratching began again. This time, it moved faster. The sound slid across the crawl space beneath the house until it reached the far wall beneath the window. Then it stopped again. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I almost believed the thing had finally left. But then I heard something else, a soft, scraping noise outside the house. I turned slowly toward the window again. For a moment I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to look. Something deep in my chest told me that whatever I saw outside was going to make everything worse. But curiosity pulled me forward again. I leaned toward the shutters and looked through the narrow crack. The yard looked quiet at first. The tree line stretched across the darkness, exactly the way it had before. But something was different now. The coyote was gone. I scanned the edge of the forest carefully. Nothing moved among the trees. Then my eyes dropped lower toward the ground near the house, and that's when I saw it. Something was standing directly beside the wall beneath my window. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was the same one I had seen earlier, crawling out from beneath the house. The man. But this time, he wasn't standing the same way. His posture looked twisted, like his body had been bent slightly forward at the spine. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and his head was tilted downward so far that his face was hidden behind his tangled hair. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there beside the house, and he was close enough that I realized something else. His feet were bare. They were planted in the dirt at an unnatural angle, like his legs weren't positioned the way a normal person would stand. I watched him for several seconds, waiting for him to move, but he didn't. The figure just stood there, perfectly still. Then slowly, his head began to rise. The movement was slow enough that it made my chest tighten with fear. His face tilted upward toward my window. Even through the darkness, I could see his eyes. They reflected the faint light from the sky and the same orange glow I had seen in the coyote's eyes earlier. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because in that instant, something clicked in my mind. The coyote had been watching the house, then it disappeared under the crawl space. Now, the man was standing outside the same place, and the scratching had started again beneath my bed the moment the coyote entered the crawl space. The figure outside the window lifted his head a little higher, and then he smiled. The expression stretched across his face, slowly, unnaturally wide. I jerked back from the window and fell onto the bed, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. For several seconds I stayed there staring at the ceiling again, trying to calm my breathing. But then the scratching beneath my bed started again, and this time, something beneath the floor began whispering my name. When I heard my name coming from beneath the floorboards, every bit of air seemed to disappear from my lungs. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't a clear voice the way someone speaking in the room would sound. It was softer than that, like a breath dragging across the wood beneath my bed, but it was unmistakable. It said my name. I stayed frozen on the mattress, staring toward the ceiling, afraid to even turn my head toward the floor. My mind kept trying to find some explanation for what I had heard. Maybe the sound only resembled my name. Maybe the house was shifting, and my brain was filling in the rest. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The whisper came again. This time it was slightly clearer. My name slid slowly upward through the wooden boards beneath my bed, stretched out in a low breath that barely sounded human. It felt like the sound was moving along the underside of the floor as the thing beneath the house crawled back and forth beneath the room. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment and pressed my hands against the mattress, trying to stay calm. My heart was beating so violently that I could feel it shaking through my arms. The whisper stopped. For several seconds, the crawl space beneath the house was completely silent again. I slowly opened my eyes and turned my head toward the window. Part of me expected to see that same twisted man standing there again, but when I looked through the gap in the shutters, the yard appeared empty. The trees stood motionless. The ground beneath the house looked dark and still, but something about the quiet outside didn't feel right. I listened carefully. The scratching beneath the floor had stopped too. For the first time since the whole thing began, the house was completely silent. That silence lasted for almost a full minute. Then I heard something outside the room. Footsteps. They weren't inside the house. They were outside. The sound came from somewhere near the side of the building, just beneath my window. The steps moved slowly across the dirt beside the wall, pressing into the ground with a heavy weight. I held my breath as the footsteps stopped directly outside my window. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then something brushed against the wooden siding of the house. The sound was slow and deliberate, like a hand dragging across the boards. My eyes drifted toward the window again. I didn't want to look. Everything in my body was telling me not to look, but the curiosity was stronger. I slowly leaned toward the shutters and looked through the narrow crack again. The yard outside was empty, but something was different. The crawl space opening beneath the house was now completely dark. I stared at it for several seconds before I realized why it looked different. Something was blocking the opening. At first I couldn't tell what it was. Then the shape shifted slightly, and I realized I was looking at a face. The twisted man was crouched halfway inside the crawl space, opening beneath the house. His head was tilted upward toward my window. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, the same orange glow I had seen in the coyote's eyes earlier. For a moment he didn't move. He just stared toward the window, then his mouth slowly opened. The smile stretched across his face again, wider than before. I pulled back from the window instantly, falling against the mattress as panic surged through my chest. My mind was racing now. If he was outside the crawl space, then what had been scratching beneath my bed just a few minutes earlier? The answer came immediately. The scratching returned beneath the floor, but this time it wasn't beneath the center of the room. It was directly beneath the edge of my bed. Something heavy brushed against the underside of the boards again. The floor creaked softly as pressure pushed upward from below. The whisper returned. My name drifted up through the floor again, stretched out in that same dry breath. But this time, the voice sounded closer, much closer. I stared down at the floorboards beside my bed, and for a brief second, I thought I saw one of the wooden boards bend upward slightly. The moment I thought I saw the floorboard move, my entire body locked up. I didn't even blink. I just stared down at the wooden boards beside my bed, waiting for it to happen again. For a few seconds, nothing moved. The house was silent again. Then the wood beneath the floor gave a slow creak. The sound was subtle, but it felt like something underneath the boards had shifted its weight. My chest tightened instantly. The board beside my bed flexed again, just slightly, like something was pressing upward against it from below. I pushed myself backward on the mattress until my back hit the wall. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from that spot on the floor. The whisper came again, my name, but this time the voice sounded clearer than before. It wasn't just a breath anymore. It was closer to an actual voice trying to form words through the wood. The sound dragged slowly across the underside of the floor, as if the thing beneath the house was crawling again. The floorboard stopped moving, but something brushed against it from below. The wood made a faint grinding sound, like fingers sliding across the beams underneath the house. My mind kept trying to explain it. Maybe the man outside had crawled back under the house. Maybe he was trying to scare me. But another thought pushed its way into my mind, one I didn't want to accept. What if the thing beneath the floor wasn't the man I saw outside? I slowly turned my head toward the window again. The shutters were still slightly open. The crawl space opening beneath the house was visible from where I sat. For several seconds I stared toward it, and then the figure moved. The twisted man slowly crawled out from the crawl space again. He dragged himself across the dirt the same way he had before, his arms and legs moving in slow, jerking motions. When he stood up this time, the moonlight caught his face more clearly. My stomach dropped, because his face didn't look human anymore. The skin around his mouth looked stretched, like it had been pulled too tight across his jaw. His eyes reflected the same orange glow I had seen in the coyote's eyes earlier, and he was smiling again. But this time the smile looked wrong. It stretched far too wide across his face. The man lifted his head slowly toward my window again. For a second, our eyes met. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of that stare. Then he tilted his head sideways, just slightly. The movement reminded me of the way animals sometimes tilt their heads when they're studying something. And that's when I heard the scratching beneath my bed again. Loud, closer. Something heavy dragged across the underside of the floorboards directly beneath me. The board beside my bed creaked again as pressure pushed upward from below. I felt my throat tighten as I looked back down at the floor. If the man was outside, then whatever was beneath the floorboards had to be something else. Something moved beneath the house again. The whisper returned. My name drifted up through the wood once more. Then, something knocked against the underside of the floor, 3 times. Slow, deliberate, exactly the same way I had knocked earlier with the broom. The realization hit me all at once. It wasn't copying me anymore. It was reminding me. I slowly looked back toward the window. The man was gone. The yard outside was empty again. But the trees at the edge of the forest were moving now, not from the wind. Something was moving through them. A shape stepped out from the shadows, the coyote. But this time, it wasn't walking on four legs. It was standing upright. For a moment it looked like a twisted mixture of both forms, the thin body of the man, the glowing eyes of the animal. And then I heard the whisper again beneath the floor, but this time, the voice didn't say my name. It said something else. It said, "Come down here." When the whisper beneath the floor said, "Come down here," something inside me felt like it collapsed. The words weren't loud, and they weren't spoken clearly the way someone in the room would speak. They slid upward through the wood like a breath pushing through cracks in the boards. But they were unmistakable. Whatever was under my house was trying to talk to me. I sat completely still against the wall, staring down at the floorboards beside my bed. My brain was desperately trying to find some kind of explanation that made sense, but none of them worked anymore. A man had crawled out from under my house. A coyote had appeared in the yard watching the same spot. And now something beneath the floor knew my name and was telling me to come closer. The scratching returned again, but this time it sounded slower. The movement dragged along the underside of the boards as if whatever was beneath the house was circling the same area repeatedly. I could hear dirt shifting under the crawl space and the faint creak of the support beams as the weight of something heavy moved from one side of the room to the other. I forced myself to breathe quietly, afraid that even the sound of my breathing might give away exactly where I was sitting. My eyes kept drifting between the floor beside my bed and the narrow crack in the shutters where the outside yard was visible. The yard looked empty again. The twisted man I had seen outside earlier was nowhere to be seen. But the forest at the edge of the property looked different now. The branches near the ground were moving slightly, as if something had just passed through them. The darkness between the trees seemed deeper than it had earlier, like the shadows had thickened. For a moment, I wondered if the thing outside had finally left. But then the scratching beneath my bed stopped again. The silence that followed felt suffocating. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. Even the faint hum from the lamp across the room sounded louder than usual. I stared down at the floorboards again. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then something pressed upward against the underside of the boards again. The wood beneath the edge of my bed lifted just slightly before settling back into place. I felt my heart jump in my chest. The pressure beneath the floor was stronger this time, like something had leaned its full weight against the support beams under the house. The board shifted again, pushing upward just enough that I could see the line between the planks widen slightly. I slowly pulled my legs farther away from the edge of the bed. The whisper came again. This time, it sounded closer, not beneath the center of the room anymore, directly beneath the spot where the floorboard had just moved. "Come down." The voice dragged the words slowly through the wood as if it was trying to force them through something that wouldn't let it speak properly. The sound carried a strange, wet rasp that made my stomach twist. I stared down at the board again. Then something brushed across the underside of the wood. The motion was slow, careful, like fingers sliding across the beams beneath the house. My entire body tensed. I imagined those fingers feeling along the underside of the floor, tracing the boards as if they were searching for a weak spot. The movement stopped directly beneath the place where I was sitting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then 3 slow knocks came from beneath the floor again, the exact same pattern, the same rhythm. My mind flashed back to the moment earlier when I had struck the floor with the broom. I realized something then that made the fear grow even stronger. The thing beneath the house hadn't just copied the sound, it had remembered it. I slowly lifted my head and looked toward the window again. The yard outside was still empty, but the darkness along the tree line looked different now. Something was standing there again. At first I thought it was the coyote, but the shape looked taller now. The figure slowly stepped forward out of the trees, and I felt the air leave my lungs. It was the same twisted man again, but something about him had changed. His posture was straighter now, almost like he was standing normally for the first time since I had seen him. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and his head tilted slightly toward the house. The moonlight touched his face, just enough that I could see his eyes again. That same orange glow stared directly toward my window. The man began walking toward the house slowly. Each step looked unnatural, like his legs were learning how to move again after being bent for too long. He stopped beneath my window. Then he lifted his head and looked up. For a second I was sure he could see me through the shutters. The scratching beneath the floor returned immediately, but now it sounded frantic. The movement beneath the house became faster, the dirt shifting violently as something crawled across the crawl space beneath my room, and the whisper came again, only this time it wasn't whispering anymore, it was laughing. The moment the laughter drifted up through the floorboards, I felt every muscle in my body tighten. It wasn't loud laughter like someone standing in the room with you. It was quieter than that, like a dry breath scraping across wood and dirt beneath the house. But the sound carried a twisted amusement in it that made my skin crawl. I sat frozen against the wall beside my bed, staring at the floor where the boards had shifted earlier. My mind kept replaying the same realization over and over again. Something was beneath the house, something that knew my name, something that was strong enough to push against the floorboards and shake the bed. And now it was laughing. The sound beneath the floor continued for several seconds before fading away again. The scratching stopped too, leaving the room completely silent once more. I slowly turned my head toward the window. The twisted man who had been standing outside a moment earlier was gone. The yard looked empty again, but something about that empty space felt wrong, like the darkness itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. I leaned forward slightly, trying to see through the crack in the shutters more clearly. The faint moonlight barely touched the ground outside, leaving most of the yard in deep shadow. The crawl space opening beneath the house was visible again. Nothing was standing there. Nothing was moving. For a moment I thought maybe whatever had been happening was finally over. Then I heard something from above me, a faint scraping noise. The sound came from the roof. At first it was subtle, almost like something brushing lightly against the shingles, but after a few seconds, the noise became clearer. Something was moving across the roof, slowly, carefully. I held my breath and listened. The movement above my room continued, the weight of something shifting across the roof one step at a time. The sound reminded me of someone crawling instead of walking. My stomach twisted as the realization sank in. Whatever had been beneath the house a moment ago was now above it. The roof creaked faintly as the weight moved across the boards overhead. The sound traveled slowly from one side of the house toward the other. Then it stopped directly above my room. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. For several seconds there was nothing but silence again. Then something tapped lightly on the roof. Not a loud impact, just a slow pressure shifting across the shingles. The sound moved toward the edge of the roof near my window. My chest tightened instantly, because that meant whatever was up there was right above me. The scratching beneath the floor suddenly stopped completely. The crawl space was silent now. The roof above me creaked again. Then something brushed slowly against the outside wall of the house. I could hear the faint drag of fingers moving along the wooden siding beneath the window. The sound slid downward slowly. Whatever was on the roof was climbing down the side of the house. My eyes locked onto the shutters beside my bed. The narrow crack between them was still open just enough to see outside. I knew I shouldn't look. Every instinct told me to stay where I was and keep my eyes away from that window. But the curiosity was stronger than the fear. I slowly leaned toward the shutters again and looked through the crack. For a moment, I saw nothing. The yard was empty. The trees stood motionless in the distance. Then something moved directly beside the window. A hand slid slowly into view along the outside wall. The fingers were long, too long. The skin looked dark and stretched tightly across the bones, and the nails at the ends of the fingers curved into thin, claw-like points. The hand dragged slowly across the wood beside the window. Then it stopped. Another hand appeared beside it. The two hands gripped the edge of the wall beneath the window frame, and slowly, something began to pull itself upward. My heart felt like it stopped beating, because whatever was climbing up the side of the house was moving exactly the same way the coyote had moved earlier when it stood on two legs. The top of a head slowly rose into view outside the window. Long tangled hair hung down over its face. Then the head lifted slightly, and two glowing orange eyes appeared in the darkness, just beyond the shutters. The same eyes I had seen in the coyote, the same eyes I had seen in the twisted man. The creature leaned closer to the window, so close that I could hear its breathing through the narrow gap in the shutters, a slow, wet breath that smelled like rot and dirt. For several seconds it simply stared through the window, and then it spoke again. This time, the voice didn't come from beneath the floor. It came from right outside my room. And it used my voice. The creature outside my window spoke in my voice. Something inside me completely shut down. The sound didn't echo through the room the way a normal voice would. It slipped through the thin gap in the shutters like a breath that had learned how to form words. For a second, my brain refused to process what I had just heard, because the voice was mine. It sounded exactly like me, the tone, the pitch, even the slight hesitation I sometimes have when I say my own name. The creature repeated it slowly through the shutters, dragging the word out like it was testing how it felt inside its mouth. My entire body felt frozen against the wall beside my bed. I couldn't even force myself to breathe normally. Every instinct in my body was telling me not to move, not to make a sound, not to let whatever was outside know exactly where I was sitting. The glowing orange eyes remained fixed on the crack in the shutters. They didn't blink. They didn't shift. They just stared through the window like the thing outside could already see me perfectly. The long fingers on the window frame tightened slightly, the claws pressing into the wood as it pulled its face closer to the gap. Its breathing was louder now, slow, wet. Each breath carried that same rotten smell that had drifted into my room earlier. It smelled like something that had been left in the heat too long. The creature tilted its head slightly. The same strange, animal-like movement I had seen earlier when the twisted man stood outside the house. Then it spoke again, but this time it wasn't copying my voice. It used my grandmother's voice. The sound was so sudden and so accurate that my chest tightened painfully. The creature whispered softly through the shutters, repeating the same gentle tone my grandmother always used when she called me inside for dinner. My mind felt like it was unraveling. It knew her voice. The creature let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like amusement. Then the claws slowly slid across the window frame again. The wood made a faint scraping sound as the nails dragged along it. I watched in horror as one of the claws pushed gently against the shutter. The board shifted slightly, just enough to widen the crack. I couldn't stay there anymore. Every instinct in my body told me that if the shutters opened even a little more, the thing outside would see me clearly. I slowly slid off the bed and crouched down beside the wall, keeping my eyes locked on the window while I moved. My legs felt weak, like they might give out if I tried to stand fully upright. The creature outside the window stopped moving the moment I shifted. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the claws slowly released the window frame. The hands disappeared from view. I heard a soft movement outside as the weight of the creature shifted against the wall. Then the roof creaked again. The thing climbed upward. The sound of its body pulling itself onto the roof above my room made the boards creak softly again. The movement continued slowly across the shingles as it crawled away from the window. The scratching beneath the floor returned immediately. My eyes snapped back toward the floor beside the bed. The sound beneath the crawl space was moving again, but this time it was faster, much faster. The dirt shifted violently beneath the house as something crawled across the beams under my room. My stomach twisted as the realization hit me. If the creature had just climbed onto the roof, then something else was still beneath the house. The scratching reached the center of the room, then it stopped. For a moment, the floorboards remained perfectly still. Then something slammed upward against the underside of the boards with enough force to make the bed frame jump slightly. The wood creaked loudly as the pressure pushed upward again. I stumbled backward toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I didn't want to stay in that room anymore. Whatever was happening inside the crawl space felt like it was building towards something worse. The whisper came again, but this time the voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like the twisted man outside, and it was laughing. The sound crawled slowly up through the floorboards beneath my feet. Then the boards bent upward again, and this time, something pushed a long claw between the cracks in the wood. When the claw forced its way between the floorboards, my mind stopped trying to understand what was happening. Up until that moment, some small part of me had still been searching for an explanation. Maybe there had been a man under the house. Maybe it had been a sick animal. Maybe everything I had seen was some strange combination of shadows and fear. But when that long, dark claw slid through the crack in the wood beside my bed, all of those explanations vanished. The claw was thin and curved, the nail at the end stretching far beyond what any human fingernail should look like. The skin around it looked stretched tight across bone, almost gray in the dim light of my room. The finger bent slowly as it forced itself farther through the narrow gap between the boards. I didn't think. I ran. My hand slipped against the door handle for a second before I managed to twist it open. The moment the door swung outward, I stumbled into the hallway, my legs barely keeping up with the panic rushing through my chest. I didn't stop moving until I reached the living room at the other end of the house. The entire house felt different now. The quiet that had settled over the rooms earlier had been replaced by something heavier. The air itself seemed thick, like the walls were holding their breath. Behind me, down the hallway, I could still hear the floor creaking in my room. Something beneath the crawl space was still moving. I stood in the middle of the living room trying to calm my breathing. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to press them against the table just to steady myself. Part of me wanted to wake my parents immediately. Another part of me was terrified of opening their bedroom door and finding something standing inside. The sound from my room stopped. For several seconds, the house fell completely silent again. Then something moved outside. The sound came from the roof again. A slow, shifting weight crossed the shingles above the living room this time. I could hear the boards creak faintly as whatever was up there crawled across the house. The movement stopped near the front of the building. Then the roof went quiet. I slowly turned toward the front window. The curtains were closed, but a faint glow from the moon slipped through the edges of the fabric. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Something inside me already knew what I was going to see. I pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. The yard was empty, but the forest at the edge of our property looked different now. The trees were moving. Not from wind, from something pushing through them. A shape stepped out from the shadows between the trees, the coyote. But it wasn't walking like a normal animal anymore. The creature stood upright again, its body twisted between two shapes as it moved slowly across the yard. For a moment, the silhouette looked like a thin man, walking awkwardly across the dirt. Then the posture shifted and the shape dropped closer to the ground again. It moved like something that couldn't decide what form it wanted to be. The glowing orange eyes lifted toward the house, toward the window, toward me. My chest tightened instantly. Even from that distance, it felt like the creature could see me standing behind the glass. The thing held that stare for several seconds, then it turned and walked back toward the forest. This time, it didn't shift forms again. The silhouette moved on two legs as it disappeared into the trees. I stayed standing there for a long time after it vanished. My hands were still shaking, and I didn't trust myself to go back into my room. Eventually, I woke my parents and told them something had been crawling under the house. My dad checked the crawl space the next morning. There were deep scratches in the dirt beneath my room, but nothing else. I never told them about the man, or the coyote, or the voice that knew my name. For the next few nights, I slept in the living room, but the sounds didn't stop. Every night after that, I heard faint scratching beneath the floorboards again. Sometimes it was soft, like something pacing slowly beneath the house. Other nights, it sounded like claws dragging across the beams under my room, and sometimes I heard whispering. My name, my grandmother's voice, my own voice, all drifting up from the darkness beneath the floor. And every once in a while, when I look out the window late at night, I still see something standing near the tree line, a thin coyote watching the house, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, waiting. Whew. And I'm terrified that one night, it's going to come back under the house. Oh. Stories like this are why so many people who grow up near deep wilderness learn very early that there are some things you simply do not talk about, and some names you should never say out loud. What makes this encounter so disturbing is that it didn't behave like a normal animal. It watched. It copied sounds. It mimicked voices. And whatever it was, it seemed to understand exactly where the narrator was, inside his own home. Encounters like this have been reported across the Southwest for generations. Stories about creatures that walk like animals, speak with stolen voices, and appear in forms that change when no one is looking directly at them. Whether you believe these are skinwalkers, something else entirely, or something we simply don't understand yet, one thing is clear: the woods are not always empty. If you've experienced something strange, paranormal, or terrifying that you still can't explain, you can send your true story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com for a chance to have it featured on the channel. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones that end. They're the ones that keep happening. Oh. Good night.